Good afternoon to everyone. We are in the seminars on theories on regulation and today, and governance. Don't forget governance. And today with us, Nir Kosti, who will speak about regulatory discretion. Nir is a PhD candidate at the Political Science Department at the Hebrew University. He's a fellow of the Advanced Graduate Studies Program, TELEM. Is also at the Center of Interdisciplinary Data Science Research at the Hebrew University. As you will see, his research focuses on regulatory discretion and the interplay between legislation and regulation, applying natural language processing, NLP, to legislative and regulatory text. So Nir, happy to have you with us and good luck with your dissertation. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I'm very happy to be here today and to see so many colleagues, friends. It's a pleasure. I would also like to thank you, David, for the organization of the event. In this presentation, I will discuss the concept of regulatory discretion, suggest some measures for discretion, and demonstrate findings based on the British legislation. We may start by saying that regulation has been expanded in recent decades, and we all know that we live in the golden age of regulation. However, there is still variation in terms of the rate of growth of regulation across countries. And in fact, it is still unknown why countries vary in making regulations. And discretion reflects the freedom to make regulatory actions. Understanding discretion may also allow us to better understand regulation or the continuous expansion of regulation. Regulatory discretion is also seen as a threat or as a democratic threat. It often raises concerns about the abuse of power by unelected officials. It raises some important normative questions about the division of labor between the parliament and bureaucracy. It raises some questions such as how much power should be granted, what powers. On the other hand, discretion is also essential for any functioning society. If the manifestation of regulation affect modernization and progress, limiting discretion may impede such progress and modernization. Regulatory discretion is also meaningful because it is about power and reflects power struggles. Discretion is usually studied in the context of the political control over the bureaucracy, but such contestations over power may exist also within parliament and within bureaucracies. In this regard, trust is a very important concept for understanding discretion. If there is no trust between politicians and civil servants and between the parliament and the executive branch, there is no discretion. But we also need to look on power struggles within bureaucracies and within parliament to understand what drives the decision to delegate discretion and which actors may veto the exercise of regulatory powers. So as we understand, discretion is important, and concerns about the grant of discretion are actually much older than the contemporary debates or the contemporary debates on regulatory explosion of our generation. In this regard, a notable point in the British history is the publication of The New Despotism by the Lord Gordon Hayward, the Chief Justice of England and Wales, over a century ago, who argued that British ministers and civil servants enjoy uncontrolled discretion and exercise arbitrary powers. Along the years, similar positions were made in many countries. I specifically focus on the UK. In 1992, a select committee of the House of the Lords commented an unlimited discretion given to ministers when considering order-making powers in law, that is, regulatory powers. And more recently, another committee of the House of the Lords noted that the legislative language itself is associated with vague words that leave large discretion. So we may understand that discretion is important, and this project has mainly three aims, and I will discuss today mainly the first two. The first aim is to suggest conceptualization that will allow to measure discretion over time across policy area, countries, and so on. The second aim is to illustrate changes over time in the styles of discretion. Discretion may have changed, and I want to better understand how. And the third aim is to explain the variation and to address the implications of them. Surprisingly, regulatory discretion has not received much attention in the literature. Other adjectives describing discretion are much more prominent when looking into the literature, especially bureaucratic discretion and judicial discretion. So in a way, there is no conceptualization in the literature that allows to measure regulatory discretion over time. Most relevant to this project is the literature on bureaucratic discretion, which mostly exists in the US context. However, these concepts are not necessarily overlapping. The powers to make regulations and their discretion, and the power to make a variety of bureaucratic actions or activities outside the regulatory arena are not similar. They are totally different. The relatively low attention on regulatory discretion also means that we don't have a theory on regulatory discretion. We don't know how, but also why countries differ in making or in delegating discretion to make regulations, and what are the implications of such variation. And also measuring discretion is an uneasy task. And one of the main central measures for discretion today is word count. Word count as a measure for discretion was developed by Huber and Shipan in their seminal work in 2002. And what they argue is basically the idea that the longer a law is, the less discretion it gives, because it micromanages policy making. In turn, they argue that when laws are short and undetailed, this means more discretion. The problem with such measures is that they don't take into account the complexity of the legal text, and they also ignore the basic characteristics of regulation. Such measures observe the legislative text as one package rather than as a text containing very different messages to different actors. So there might be short laws with no delegations or with no delegation of regulation, but also long and indeterminate laws that delegate massive powers. What I'm trying to say here is that we need to take into account also the content of legislation and not only the length. As you can see, these research gaps address the need in studying regulatory discretion, especially in cross-national and longitudinal perspective. So some clarifications for the main terms. When I discuss regulation, I refer to secondary legislation, to legislation made by bureaucrats compared to primary legislation, which is made by parliaments. When talking about delegation of regulatory power, I will refer to the transfer of powers to make regulations from the legislator to the executive branch. And once those powers are delegated, the level of freedom given to use those powers reflects the level of discretion. One main point of this project that makes it distinct compared to other works on the topic is the understanding that when studying regulatory discretion, we must consider delegation first. In most countries, the powers to make regulations are not inherent. This means that in order to exercise discretion, we need to have first an authorization in law. So to understand discretion or to measure discretion, we need to identify first the act of delegation. And the idea is that the qualities of such delegation, whether the power shall or may be used, what is the content of that powers, how agents are dominant in the regulatory process. What they describe is the discretionary powers agents have to make regulations. And this brings us to the conceptualization of regulatory discretion. As I see it, the conceptualization of regulatory discretion hangs upon three main dimensions. The exercise of regulatory powers, the regulatory content, and the regulatory process. So the first dimension is about the discretion in choosing whether to make a regulation. So the legislative language does one of two things. It either requires agents to make regulations or give them the autonomy to make regulations. I will explain much more about each of these dimensions in the next slides. Second dimension is the regulatory content and the discretion in determining basically the regulatory content. And here the focus is on the content of regulation, and the question is whether whether the content of regulation is instructed or it is bounded by some provisions, and how the language allows applicability, or how the language of delegations can be applied in very different circumstances based on how vague the language of delegation is. The third dimension is about the regulatory process and how freely agents can make regulations considering other actors involved in the regulatory process. Let's go now one by one. So we can start by discussing the first dimension, and the idea here is whether the exercise of regulatory powers is obligated or allow decision-making upon the agent's will. For example, legislator may require a minister to make regulations regarding the accessibility of public transport, or allows a minister to make by regulation standards of medical care in some disease. If it sounds familiar to you, I'm talking about the type of delegation and whether delegation is mandatory or permissive. The idea is that legislator can tell agents what to do or enable them powers to make actions on their will. And the distinction between mandatory and permissive delegation is often understood based on the use of the modals must, shall, or may. The assumption is that mandatory delegation provides less discretion than permissive delegation. When decisions are optional, more autonomy is given to agents. The second dimension of discretion refers to how the content of regulation can be stretched into different activities and circumstances. To understand discretion in determining the regulatory content, we need to be aware of two measures. The first is content provisions that frame what regulation may, must, or must not do. The first assumption, built on a recent work by Mattia Vanoni and his colleagues, is basically the idea that the more of such content provisions, the less discretion. I would also add that the more binding a provision is, the less discretion. I will show the different types of provision in the next slide, but the idea is that if the legislator determines what regulation shall include, it gives much less discretionary powers than if the powers include some permissive provision about what regulations may do. Another measure for the regulatory content, or the second dimension of discretion, is the inclusion of certain parts of speech that leaves room for interpretation. And this idea or assumption is built on a recent work made by Matthew Williams on British legislation. And what he argues is that the more indeterminate parts of speech associated with the legislative language means basically more discretion. And again, I will talk about it in the next few slides. Okay, so for the first measure, once delegation is made, it may be accompanied by three kinds of provision. Permissive provisions that tell agents what regulations may include, mandatory provisions that tell agents what regulations must include, and constraining provisions that tell agents what regulations must not or shall not include. I argue that the more of such types, the more of such provisions, and the more binding they are, the less discretion. Another important matter when reading laws is how clear the messages they provide. If the message is unclear, then the discretion given is basically high. But if the legislative language entail very determinate part of speech, this means that messages are much more clear and there is much less room for interpretation. I specifically focus on some vague parts of speech, such as adjectives, adverbs, and conditional conjunction, that we can think of them as giving more flexibility in interpreting those messages in laws. So adjectives and adverbs allows concepts in laws to be stretched or narrowed. And so agents must determine their meaning if they exist. Following Matthew Williams, I use specific indeterminate adjectives and adverbs, basically a list of around 40 to 50 adverbs that were made by, or they were collected with advice of some legal experts, such as reasonably, proper, appropriate, or vulnerable. So basically, this selected list of adjectives and adverbs create extra significant or it creates some significant indeterminacies in law. In addition, the inclusion of conditional conjunctions such as or, if, and allows the text to be adapted also in very different circumstances. Studies on discretion, moving to the third dimension, studies on discretion refer to also to procedures that can narrow or stretch discretionary power. When discussing regulation, we can think of mainly two of such procedures. Procedures that are mentioned in the legislative language are usually consent and consultation. The idea is that the involvement of actors, especially veto actors who can vote down regulations once they are made, before they are made, meaning basically that there is a need to make more negotiations and to have more agreements before regulation is made. So negotiations and agreements mean compromises, and this naturally mean less discretion. I distinguish between consent and consultation, although the latter can also be meaningful. Additionally, the idea is that the more actors are involved in the regulatory process can also narrow or limit discretion. Now, measures for consent and consultation, the idea of, or what I'm doing actually when looking at consent and consultation procedures is to divide them between parliamentary actors, and in the UK there are mainly two procedures of parliamentary scrutiny, the negative procedure and the affirmative procedure, but also the involvement of other actors such as executive actors, civil actors, and business actors. Okay, let's move to the method. So the use of natural language processing has been rapidly growing for handling several tasks on legal text, including information extraction. It has become in recent years more and more common to use such techniques that allow to make texts that have originally been made manually in an accurate and fast, quick manner. The most common approach to extract information today is bag of words. In this approach, texts are split into different words or tokens, and a set of words is filtered often determiners such as the, to, that usually are the most frequent in any kind of text. Then tokens are assigned to probability distribution to analyze association with parties, speakers, countries, and so on. Such methods are limited because they ignore some key information in text, and I'm referring to the synthetic and to the lexical relations between words. Written text comes with a language structure. If you want to understand whether the word order is a noun or a verb, or whether the Secretary of State is the subject of a sentence, back-of-word approaches won't allow us to do so. In this project, I applied rule-based labeling following the work of Vanoni and his colleagues who measure bureaucratic discretion. I mentioned that before. And the idea in rule-based labeling is to parse the lexical and synthetic structure of a sentence and to understand how words interact and link one another. How does this work? What we look for is the structure of a sentence. Each sentence structure consists of words and links, as you can see here in the arrows in the figure. And basically each structure has a root. In this example, we can see the word make, which is the root of the sentence. And the root has different paths into the words in the sentence. So for example, in the word make is linked to the word provision, which is linked to the word about, which is linked to councils and to regional. Additionally, the word make is also linked to the word may and to the word secretary, okay, and so on. These links are represented as dependency tree, where each word is linked to another word. How do we get here? I use the software Spacey, which is an open source software in Python. And the synthetic dependency parser splits the text, each sentence in the text into words, then the algorithm categorizes words with words in text associated with the part of speech they have, for example, whether a word is verb, an adverb, and so on. And then the parser goes through the list of words one by one and see whether they are, whether and how they are linked one another. So basically the code they have iterate over rows and sections and then divides each section into sentences and ask whether a sentence includes any regulation term, such as regulation, order, rule, or by law. And then a synthetic dependency parser is applied and returns a dependency tree. And the dependency tree is met with some extraction rules that identify delegation, content provisions, and other elements. Of course, later the data is aggregated. This table is a glimpse into such patterns or extraction rules of mandatory and permissive delegation. So for each element extracted, I created several rules. This is only a very short glimpse. So for example, here what you can see that mandatory delegation consists of a strict modal like must or shall, plus a non-negated verb like make, specified, and so on, and a regulation term. So when this rule is met with the dependency tree of any given sentence, it returns that a mandatory delegation is found. Okay, same is applied for permissive delegation and for other elements. To validate the extraction rules, I coded manually 10,000 sentences and improved those frames again and again. I see that I don't have much time, but I would just say that there are 4 main measures in machine learning that evaluate basically the model, and they are relatively high here. F-scores are high for most elements and above 0.8. The other are above 0.7, which is okay. And naturally, procedure is better than recall, which means that there are relatively more false negative than false positive in the model. So naturally, I miss some elements, but it is inevitably when applying such textual analysis. Data is British laws made between 1900 and 2020. We talk about nearly 40 million words and 6,700 laws. Sources for the data are from Matthew Williams and legislation.gov.uk, which is the official database of UK legislation run by the National Archives. Okay, let us begin with some overview graphs of British legislation along the years. I really don't have enough time, but I would just say that, as you can see, the number of laws has been declining over the years, but the number of words has been increasing. So we have more legislative text along the years, and we also have more structure. We have more sections and more sentences per each law. Before demonstrating all the quantitative findings, I would also like to draw your attention to an overview about what I term an old style of discretion and a new style of discretion. As you can see here, Section 3 of the Factories Act 1961 delegate powers to make regulations about the temperature in factories. Such an old style of discretion includes permissive delegation. There are no content provision that makes structures about what regulation must, may, or must not do. There is an excessive use of indeterminate part of speech. You can see 3 loose adjectives and 4 conditional conjunctions that allows flexibility and applicability in different circumstances. And we can also see that the sentence is very, very long. Okay, and there is no parliamentary control over making such regulation. A new style of discretion, in contrast, for a more recent example, includes also a permissive delegation, but then there are 8 content provisions. Most of them are permissive. They demonstrate what regulations may do. There is also one mandatory provision that says what regulation must do, and there are on average 1 conditional conjunction per sentence and no adjectives or adverbs that create significance in determinancies. There is also parliamentary scrutiny. It is not included here, but actually the law states that all regulation made by the Secretary of State or national authorities are being subjected to a negative procedure, which allows to either House of Parliament to veto regulation within a period of time after they are made. Okay, so we may understand that changes in the ways laws are written are meaningful. We see that the new style of discretion is far more clear and structured, and discretion in this regard has been formalized. Now, let's see a few more graphs, and I will do it a bit briefly, unfortunately. So first of all, we see an increase in the number of delegations along the years. We know that the legislative text is growing, but we also know that the number of delegations are growing. But the question is now how those delegations are split between mandatory and permissive delegation. And as this figure shows, both permissive delegation and mandatory delegation have increased over the years. But if you see the values on the y-axis, it seems there is a tendency to give more autonomy to the exercising of regulatory powers upon agents' will. The ratio between mandatory and permissive delegation is range around 1 to 6. So for every mandatory delegation, there are 6 permissive delegations. Now, for the second dimension, the content provision, we see a relatively moderate increase along the year. The y-axis represents the number of content provisions per delegation. And we see basically that the number has been risen over time, but we don't know exactly how it is divided into the different types of provisions. So what we actually see here in this graph is that the bulk of content provisions are permissive provision that basically allow or basically tells what regulations may do. So we have actually a decrease in the number of mandatory provisions and some high punctuation regarding constraining provisions. Regarding the clarity of delegations and provisions and how determinate they are, we see that while the number of delegation and provision has increased, the number of conjunctions and adjectives and adverbs per delegation has been declined. I note specifically that this figure is based upon the adjectives and adverbs that create extra indeterminacies, but also the general trend is toward less adjectives and adverbs per sentence and delegation. Concerning the third dimension of discretion, we see that consultation and consent are kind of rare in the British context. We don't see any kind of increase over the years, and the number are quite low. The requirement to consent with some actors before making regulation is actually declining along the years. What you can see here basically is those procedures with non-parliamentary actors, but when taking into account parliamentary control or the parliament in the process of scrutinizing regulation, we see that the number are actually rising along the years. And basically regarding negative procedure, numbers are much higher because many of these sentences specifically, again, for negative procedure, refer to chapters and even for entire laws. So there is actually much higher percentage of regulation which are subject to negative procedures, and I need to figure out how to reflect that better. So for the main findings, we see a very complex overview of regulatory discretion in the UK. Regarding the first dimension, we see basically that the use of permissive delegation rather than mandatory delegation provides more discretion. For the second dimension, we see more content provisions on one hand. On the other hand, we see that those provisions are mostly permissive and unbinding. We also see that there is an increase in a decrease, in the determinate part of speech along the years, which means less discretion, less applicability of those words into different circumstances. And we also see regarding the regulatory process that there is more regulation subject to negative procedure, but it is actually a very soft mechanism of parliamentary scrutiny because Parliament in this case is actually can be actually very passive and allow a stream of many regulations without looking into them. We also saw that there are rare consultation and consent required before regulation is made. In conclusion, we see a surge of more regulatory powers. Basically, see in the research data based on regulation, but here in this study, we see how the expansion of regulation echoes the legislative text, how the British ministers have more and more powers and autonomy to decide whether to exercise regulatory powers. We see that the content of regulation is more structured and allows less room for interpretation. And we also see more tendency to use parliamentary scrutiny, but usually the negative procedure, which is relatively soft. What is next? More theory and implications. We may talk about it here now in the QA. We need to better understand those new styles of discretion, or basically different styles of discretion, to understand their meaning, whether they are better democratically, whether they allow a more functioning governance system, or they also create some gridlocks. We can also create more measures that would cluster better how the different measures interact, and to push for more research in more countries, more languages, and more policy areas. So I finished. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Nir. Time for questions, comments, and remarks. I will take them as they come, and please feel free to join. So the first one is from Carlos, and depending on the nature of the comment, we'll take them together with Carrie's and Itai's and so on. So Carlos, please go on.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much, Nir, and congratulations on this really nice approach that you develop in order to conceptualize and measure regulatory discretion. I also think that you made it quite easy for us to understand what your work is about, so congrats on that. I have two small comments. So the first of them is, if I understood correctly, throughout your presentation, you're implying that the presence of conditional conjunctions necessarily results in greater discretion. Correct me if I'm wrong. I was wondering whether this is the case, always, necessarily, and how you justify this, okay? So that would be my first comment, very specific, actually. And the second one is not directly related to what you presented today, but the aims that you have in your project. You said that you want to explore and understand variation of regulatory discretion in different countries. So I was wondering whether legal language style is standardized across countries, and if that's not the case, how you plan to reconcile the fact that there may be variation in the styles that countries are using in order to formulate laws. So for example, sometimes I was wondering whether variations in the use of must or may might always have to do with the type of regulation or the style that the country is using in order to formulate laws. I don't know if this is the case at all, because I'm no expert in legal language, but maybe this is something that is interesting for you to think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and we'll go on directly to Kari unless Nir insist on answering now. No? So please, Kari. We don't hear you, Kari, for some reason. Maybe go Itai first, and then
hear me now. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. Sorry, Nir. This is really terrific work, and it's great to see it. The project moving forward. I think you're really onto something important here. I'm going to offer just a couple of reactions and points that you can take. You can respond to all of them or none of them or whatever. The first would be just to keep in mind, and I think it might help to situate discretion in the relationship to the overall power. And it was interesting that you look at the number of delegations over time, that they're increasing, right? And so agencies might well be more constrained, that is, have less discretion over the powers that they've been given, but they might be given more powers, right? And so if we're thinking about sort of the role of regulators, the role of the administrative state in government overall, agencies that have been given more responsibilities or have a greater domain of power might have more of an impact in society, even if those delegations are each of them a little bit more constrained than they used to be in the past. So that's something to just, I think, situate the discretion that you're trying to measure within the context of perhaps nevertheless overall expanding power of administrative agencies. Second, when it comes to the different dimensions of discretion, as you can imagine, I think that's a very profitable and useful approach to thinking about the delegations and how to describe them. I wanted to know a little bit more about how these different dimensions get added together. Does each dimension count the same, or should some dimensions matter more than others? How do those get put together? Are you just taking each of them as the same or not? Along the same lines, there's the possibility that some statutory delegations may contain a whole host of restrictions, but nevertheless one single catch-all exemption provision, right? And if agencies can exploit those exemptions and drive a truck through the holes in the rules, they may end up with a lot more discretion, notwithstanding what you are measuring. And I know in the US, we talk about how agency rulemaking, for example, has become ossified with the layering of procedure upon procedure and procedure. But some of the work by Connor Rasso looked and saw that, in 50% of the rulemakings in the US, the agencies don't go through the notice and comment, the normal procedure. They go through the good cause exemption. So anyway, it's something to just at least be aware of and take into account. Another last little point, and then I'm going to close with one suggestion that might address at least some of these points. The last point is that I think discretion is a function not just of the language of the delegation, but of the choice space, as I might call it, available to the agency. So there may be two delegations, two contexts in which the delegation specifically tells the agency to take one particular type of action, right? And yet the agency will have can have different levels of discretion, even with that same language, depending upon how many choices were actually available to it. So if the statute says agency shall do X, but the agency could have chosen A, B, C, and X, Y, and Z, right? That's a lot less discretion available than if the statute said the agency shall do X, and all the choices really available to the agency were X, Y, and Z, right? So the former agency is more constrained than the latter. All right, so with all of that put on the table, I mean, some of this will be noise in what you're doing, and that may be the best you can do. But I do think one thing you might consider doing to help give some of your readers more sense of validity to what you're finding would be to actually see how well your measures of the degrees of discretion map onto what might be an expert judgments. So if you could give a sample of your provisions to a group of lawyers or even law students, have them read them. Do they distinguish between the high, the medium, and the low for discretion provisions in the same way that your algorithms are distinguishing? And that would at least give the reader some sense that what you're capturing does correspond to what human readers would understand to be a greater amount of discretion.
Thank you very much, Kerry. And I wonder, Nir, if we can continue to hear more comments, because I think maybe this is the best way to go, but it's up to you really, Nir.
Yes, please.
Yes, so please, Itai, and afterwards, Alicia.
Thank you, David. So first of all, I join my previous colleagues in congratulating on a very impressive project. It was wonderful to hear how far along you've gone already. And I already, some of the points I wanted to make, Kerry already made. So I'll just say 2 points at this stage. And it both might be relevant for the explanations. One is because you put so much weight on the language of the legislation, it might be worthwhile to see to what extent it's just a change in legislative drafting styles, or whether there's a policy choice that really tells you a story about separation of powers between Parliament and the executive branch. And I can easily put you in touch with British experts in legislative drafting. It might be worthwhile to see, to look at the different manuals throughout the years of legislative drafting. And I assume that some of it, they just became more sophisticated in legislative drafting and know that many indeterminate words are problematic, etc. So it's worthwhile to see if this might be an explanation. Another interesting question that might be relevant is, and maybe it's worthwhile to try to see if you can check it, is which of those provisions or which of the regulations are right restricting, because there's an assumption here, because the UK was under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, and they have their limitation clause like we have in Israel. And the first one is that it should be prescribed by law. And one of the questions in the court law cases is to what extent the delegation could be broad, or to what extent it has to be determinate. And if it's too broad and it infringes on rights, it might be invalidated. So it might be worthwhile to see if there's a relationship between whether it's a right restricting measure and whether it's more determinate in those cases. Perhaps if I can, just one more small point or suggestion. I'm not sure about the title or the term you use, because regulatory discretion, at least for me, and I think for many lawyers, it would sound like what you said is bureaucratic discretion. So generally, discretion for the regulators, how to use their powers, etc. I think you're more accurate in saying that you're measuring rulemaking discretion or rulemaking power and discretion in using this power. So I'll stop here, and great project, and maybe we'll continue later between us with more points. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Itai. And Alicia De Monte, please.
Thank you so much. Yes, I joined the congratulations because really it's an amazing work, and I'm very glad to be here and to have learned so much. I have two questions and a comment for you. The first is, I think there may be an elephant in the room that is independence, regulatory independence, which instead has been much more studied maybe as a topic. And I was wondering whether there are overlappings or whether discretion is completely orthogonal to independence somehow. So how I think it can be problematized as the relationship between the two concepts. Second is a note on the use of deontics as a measure of a proxy for especially the must and the absence of discretion. Italian experience maybe, unless it is backed by some credible, let's say, sanction for non-compliance, it may really be sound like a symbolic expression, a signal that you send to some constituency. No, the regulator must do that. But if the regulator doesn't comply, there is no way no way for litigation, no way for anything. Because simply it can be postponed without any consequence, which is a problem actually. So this can be. So I would see, and this is something that I'm really thinking of. Whether the or else clause, and in this moment I'm referring to Saba Siddiqui Institutional Grammar Tools 2.0 and all the previous work, whether the or else are really the proxy for discretion or not. If they combined with the deontic, they really provide a better operationalization of discretion and mandates and whatever. My last comment is about the role of interests and consultations. And your hypothesis, the fourth hypothesis, is that the more the actors, the higher the constraints. Actually, there is a nice stream of literature in the European Union on the relationship between the Commission and interests that proved that when the interests are many and pulverized, the regulator can engineer coalitions supporting their own discretion. So actors and let's say stakeholders, it depends on the literature you are referring to, but they really can make a difference if they are resourceful, vested interests, resourceful with veto powers. Otherwise, they may not make such a difference to the discretion of the regulator or the bureaucracy, depending on how you frame the issue. And these are my comments for you, but it's really, really good work, good job. Compliment.
Thank you very much, Alicia. And I would say also that she's running workshops on rules as data in the ECPR. So you can have the data or the information on rules as data there. And we have Bel, Rotem, and Hanan going on. So please, are you fine with that, Nir?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Rotem, Bel, Rotem, and Hanan.
First of all, thank you, Nir. It was fascinating, and congratulations for your project. I just want to add a really quick comment regarding what Carrie and Italia, following Carrie and Italia words. I think that you should distinguish between de facto consideration and de jure, because if you add into the point the courts, so in many cases, administrative courts interpret may as must. And then in many cases, it really narrows the de facto considerations. So maybe that's just something that you should be aware of. That's it. Thank you very much. It was really, really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Bel. And Rotem, please.
So first of all, I will join the congratulations. It's an amazing and fascinating project. So congratulations, Nir. I'm happy to see how it develops throughout the years and your work on it. I have, let's say, 2.5 comments or points. First of all, you presented in your example a situation where the must conjunctive came third. And I wondered whether you have some data or assumption about why does it happen? Because one would assume that the must should probably come first. First, you tell him what the regulator needs to do and then what he may do. And I wonder whether you have some assumption or information about how many times this occurs. The second thing was, I wonder more a bit about the work David does about agentification. I wonder if you have some data about the actors being delegated with the discretion. So you tell us that there's more delegation of discretion, but I wonder who are the actors that actually receive that kind of power? Are that the ministers, the authorities, and maybe you can in some way track through the years, as David did to agencies, whether those actors actually expense or not. And the related point is that maybe when you think through that kind of process, whether there is some kind of phenomenon that we might see a legislation creates a new agency or a new regulator, but then it actually delegates the power to another agent, like the minister, and whether you have cases like that. So that can be also an interesting point also when you kind of speak about the power relationships. So what does it mean when I have more agencies, but the actors that actually receive the power and the discretions are the ministers that are in charge of that. So those were kind of the points and comments I had on the matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rotem. And now Hanan, please. We don't hear you, Hanan.
Okay,
yeah,
hi. Thanks, Nir. Ah, interesting. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Nir. I really enjoyed it. It was very good. I was thinking about powers, so maybe I'll just drive this point a little bit further. Who is being empowered by this process that you're seeing? Who is getting the power that maybe didn't have this power before? So that's one question. And another question is, what are the? I mean, you talked about theory, and I kept waiting. Where's the explanation? Or what's the economic? What's the institutional? What's the political background? Which is explaining these things that you're seeing. So, but great work.
Thank you. More questions, comments, and so on, or we are ready to hear Nir. I see Sharon Gilad, please.
Yeah, Nir, I apologize. I had to leave before, so I apologize in advance one, I have a very simple question, and I apologize also if it's already been asked. But I want to ask whether, just a simple, what is the correlation between the number of words and the different factors? So I see it as different factors, right? The content provisions, the determinate part of speech, and involvement of other actors. So these are three different factors. I don't know if you see it that way, but it's kind of different dimensions. And so I think like a simple paper would be one to just say, like, what's your position on the Uber, like, what's your empirical position on the Uber and Shipan way of methodology? And I would have thought that indeterminate part of speech should be highly correlated with their, because that was their claim, so, and then can you, going back to Carrie's position on how do you put those things together? Do you then kind of do an aggregate type of index? So are you able to show that, yeah, maybe there's a strong correlation with indeterminate part of speech, but then these other parts, these other factors are negatively correlated, uncorrelated, so that overall, if you were to aggregate this all together, how much do you reach something with, is there simple measurement maybe good enough, or do we really need a whole different complex measure?
Thank you, Sharon. And Nir, the floor is yours. We are almost over time, so choose, few comments and respond to them. And of course, you are free to communicate with all people here later on. And you are most welcome to send us comments as well. Please, Neil.
Okay, so first of all, thanks for all of you for being here and attending the events. It means a lot, and those comments are really helpful and useful. I would like to raise some issues. I will not cover all of your comments, but just a few. I will start with the comments made by Sharon and Carrie about the measures and how. First of all, I know that the current situation where I have very different measures and I'm not trying to aggregate between them, create some indeterminacy in providing a message or an argument in this research. I have I have been trying to do such, to create such measures that, let's say, are more sophisticated in aggregating the different dimensions and also the different measures, and it's still in progress. So I hope that I will be able to basically to aggregate better and to provide more or less a quick answer of how discretion evolves over time, and that's again in progress. For the comment about the agencyfication, I would say that in parliamentary countries compared to presidential countries, most powers are delegated to ministers who hold or who are the head of cabinet departments. This means that although we know that there has been an increase in the number of regulatory agencies, those agencies are not getting or are provided the regulatory powers, but again, those powers are much few compared to the powers who are given to ministers. And I would also say that when, actually it's a direction for a research that when comparing powers delegated to regulatory agencies and to ministers, we see that there is much more discretion for cabinet ministers than to regulatory agencies. I believe it's an important and vital for this research to understand to whom powers are delegated, and it matters. But I don't have the data to show you about it right now. I would also like to say that regarding perhaps theory that courts matter, and especially along or as much as states lose battles in courts regarding especially interdeterminacies in laws or the use of vague adverbs and adjectives, we see that also the drafting style or the way laws are written is changing. I think that in the UK, this is perhaps part or it's a partial explanation for the decrease in the number of adjectives and adverbs that have been increased. I would also say that the UK, if we observe the UK compared to other countries, the existence of a majority government or a party that basically holds the whole coalition also makes the whole idea of delegation and discretion very different than in other countries. And the idea is that the actors who delegate the powers are the same actors who implement those powers. In other countries, the situation is quite different. I would say that in Israel, for example, where there are more coalitionary governments, we see basically that discretion is usually constrained upon the consent of other actors. So to make regulation in Israel, at least in many cases, there is a requirement to have the consent of other cabinet ministers, which is not the case in the UK, because in the UK, basically, cabinet ministers are from the same party.
I'll say thank you very, very much, Nir. Thank you all for your participation. It was an excellent presentation and promising research. See you soon. Bye-bye.